day, ENG2D. Today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some summary information regarding tragedy. Firstly, we'll take a look at a definition of tragedy made from a writer named Aristotle in his writing called the Poetics. This piece of writing established a very general definition of what tragedy is and what a tragic hero was. The second note that we'll take a look at has to do more specifically with Shakespeare's definition of tragedy and what his tragic heroes looked like. Now, Shakespeare based a lot of his definition of tragedy and tragic hero on this dude here, Aristotle, and his original explanation or definition of tragedy. I'm going to have you take a note. So please, just as you are watching this video, grab a separate, fresh sheet of paper and just take a note on this information. I highly encourage you to do that because this information will more deeply get into your long-term memory if you actually write it out. So you can just stop the video as necessary. So let's take a look here. Tragedy, in very, very simple terms, just means that the protagonist died. Certain concepts were drawn from, as I mentioned, Aristotle's Poetics that require that a tragic hero is of high standing, so of some noble birth usually, must oppose some kind of conflicting force. It could either be external, something outside of himself, or internal, again, battling his own conscience. It should be the tragic hero should be dominated by something called hamartia, which is defined as tragic flaw or some excess of some character trait. So, for example, too much pride or foolish pride, hubris. Now, for Macbeth, we see that his character flaw or tragic flaw is ambition or greed, right? He is reaching beyond his status in life, right? And again, we know that by doing so, he upsets what the Elizabethans viewed as the way the world worked with the chain of being. This hamartia leads eventually to the tragic hero's downfall. And because, of course, of his status, his noble or high standing, it brings a whole bunch of other people down with him. So yeah, because he is, has so much power, he brings a lot of other people down with him. Many of these people innocent. Okay, so I'm putting a star beside this information here because this information here talks about the idea of catharsis, which is the purpose of drama in general. So the action in tragedy must be recognizable or believable, really is what that means. We must believe that the situation and what's happening is actually plausible. It could potentially happen. And when we look at Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, it is quite believable. It is, something that could potentially happen. We believe that that characters and people can definitely be completely blinded by lust for power or position, right? Through seeing the play enacted, the audience has its passion or suffering raised. So some kind of emotion is piqued in the audience members. The conclusion of the action thus brings a release from that passion. This again is called catharsis. And this idea of catharsis is often touted as the purpose of drama. So what is catharsis? Again, it is the releasing or purging of some strong repressed emotion. Now, usually it is pity or sadness, some kind of understanding, but some very strong emotion. And we're going to talk about how at the end of Macbeth, we definitely do feel like a range of emotions from pity. Certainly we pity certain things about both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. And we do feel, we do feel some sympathy for them as they are both, they've both been duped so heavily by the equivocation of the witches. But we also have some respect left over for them as well. And we'll talk about that in the second note. In Elizabethan theater, tragedy is that which occurs when essential good is wasted. So I'm going to mention that one more time. I'm going to repeat that. Tragedy for the Elizabethans is that which occurs when essential good is wasted. And we're going to see, or we're going to, explain how throughout Macbeth this happens over and over and over again until eventually there is a driving out of the evil. So again, tragedy is that which occurs when essential good is wasted through disaster or death in the process of driving out evil, right? And we see here, of course, that Malcolm goes to England, goes to the court of Edward, and he is given the support that he needs to then invade and drive out the tyrant, drive out the monster, drive out Macbeth, the evil. Now, by doing so, of course, he reestablishes the chain of being, and peacefulness in the country is seen as a result of that, setting that chain of being right. Okay, let's take a look at some critical terms here. The first one is a term that we don't really hear too often, but is quite central in our understanding of what tragedy is. The term is anagnorisis. It is the tragic recognition or insight of the tragic hero or the protagonist. It's also called self-knowledge, and it is a moment of insight and understanding in the mind of the tragic hero as he suddenly comprehends the web of fate that he has entangled himself in. And we see this moment of anagnorisis right near the end in Act 5, where Macbeth finally realizes he's been completely duped by the witches, that he has fallen for their equivocation. And again, equivocation, half-truths, right? Now, this actual moment of anagnorisis happens when Macduff explains that he was not technically born of woman, which likely suggests that he was born by cesarean section. So the moment Macduff comes true on, this revelation that he was not actually technically born of woman, Macbeth realizes that he has been completely duped by the witches. It is a moment of recognition of how entangled he has allowed himself to become. All right, so hamartia, again, we mentioned this before, is tragic error, often called tragic flaw. It is a fatal error or simple mistake by the protagonist that eventually leads to his downfall. And again, for Macbeth here, we see that this hamartia, or this tragic flaw, is his ambition. It is his greed. It brings him to make a lot of decisions that eventually lead to his own downfall. Peripeteia is the plot reversal, or the turning point, where the protagonist goes from feeling pretty darn secure to realizing how vulnerable he is. Now, in this play, it doesn't always happen like this, but in this play, Macbeth, we see that the plot reversal and this moment of anagnorisis, of truly understanding, his own, the position he's put himself in, his own truth, happen actually at the same time. The turning point is when Macduff explains, "No, I was not born of woman. So let's fight. Let's get this on, because tonight either you're going to die or my soul is going to die," right? So, all right, let's get a little bit more specific here about Shakespeare's particular tragedies here. Okay, so let me just set this up here. Okay, so Shakespeare's tragedies, more specifically. So again, tragedy more generally concerns the lives of great men. We've already established this from Aristotle and his Poetics. Men of some status, position, and power. So again, yes, this definitely pertains to Macbeth. He is a man of position and power, and nobility, right? He comes to ruin, right? He comes to his own downfall. That's point number 2, by some kind of misguided decision. His own demise because of his own decisions, right? So 3 parts to this, really. So a great man who comes to ruin because of a misguided decision. Okay, so for tragedy, for Shakespeare, and again, we're going to see lots of crossover to Aristotle's definition. So Shakespeare's tragedies depict a real world for us in which both good and evil are present. So again, yes, this idea that the action must be believable, the characters must be believable, and the plot must be believable. And we've already established that for Macbeth, for this play, it is very, very, very believable. His characters are human with both strengths and weaknesses. Absolutely, we see that the characters are not flat characters, meaning one-dimensional. These characters are, the main characters here are certainly rounded characters, which means that they have development to them. They're not just either good or evil. They can be both evil and good. So by having his characters well-rounded, we see that they have strengths and weaknesses. And again, the fact that they have strengths and weaknesses leads to some conflict outside of themselves, but also internally as well. They must do battle not only with others, again, external conflict, but with themselves. So some internal conflict. And we definitely see both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth struggling with some internal conflict. Poor Lady Macbeth, well, I don't know how poor she is, but we do have some sympathy for her, right? Because she actually goes right off the deep end. She loses her mind because of all of this guilt, all of this internal conflict that she's facing. And we see that she is constantly washing her hands, trying to get the guilt off of her, and it eventually cracks her, right? This is the true nature of tragedy, in that we can see people looking for perfection, but because of certain misguided principles, bring misfortune to themselves and others, right? It's innocent people. So again, for the Elizabethans, tragedy meant that essential good is wasted, right? So lots of innocent people get brought down in, the downfall. In tragedy, the hero experiences a great decline, right? A downfall. We pity the great man who is declining, and we feel for ourselves as we can identify with his weaknesses, right? Not that we would kill, certainly, I would like to hope none of us would kill in order to gain position and power. But greed is definitely something that we have all experienced. So this whole idea of greed taking root in us and prompting us to, make some really bad decisions, we've all been there, right? When we have made poor decisions because of greed and envy. So absolutely, we can identify with the downfall. The tragic hero experiences some awareness of his destiny. And again, this is that moment of anagnorisis where Macbeth realizes the equivocation of the witches has led him to become too trusting. The half-truths, right? The half-truths of equivocation. So he understands who he really is in this moment. It is a moment of self-awareness, of self-knowledge, of his tragic flaw, his decisions, and his destiny as a result of his decisions. So again, anagnorisis. As the play progresses, there is a move to isolation and increased inner thought. And again, we definitely see this in Macbeth. In Act 5, he is completely isolated. Everyone has deserted him, and he even says that he is like a bear, like a baited bear chained up. He cannot fly, he can't go anywhere. And again, lots of increased inner thought. The whole tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in, this petty pace from day to day soliloquy is reflective of this increased inner thought. In failing, the tragic hero must still remain great. Now, this is an interesting point that is debatable for some, but hear me out on this. He still must remain great in some ways. Otherwise, there is no tragedy. Only a bad man getting punished justly, and that is good. So how does Macbeth still remain great? Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit in the next note. We'll get into it a little bit more. He remains courageous in the end. He doesn't complain, and he's quite brave, right? So again, he is still great in some ways. In tragedy, though, not all is lost. For Shakespearean tragedy, not all is lost, because even though the hero dies, some good comes. At the end, there is a promise of renewed order. So please make sure you put a star beside that information as you are copying this out, as you are taking a note, because this last point is a very important point for understanding Shakespearean tragedies. Now, essentially, a Shakespearean tragedy means that there are going to be a lot of dead bodies on the stage at the end. In fact, our play Macbeth is Shakespeare's goriest and bloodiest, with the most dead bodies on the stage at the end. You're going to also encounter another pretty gory play, Hamlet, in grade 12. There are a lot of dead bodies at the end of that one as well. So again, for Shakespeare, his tragedies always end with this promise of renewed order. And again, we do see this at the end as the tyrant Macbeth is finally killed by his nemesis, Macduff. And in so doing, the chain of being is reestablished in the proper order, with a real natural king on the throne being Malcolm, and peace is reestablished in the country of Scotland. So again, we do see this promise of renewed order, and a bunch of other really good things happen at the end as well, right? A bunch of people are promised wealth and fortune and new titles, such as the first earls of Scotland. They're going to welcome people who have left the country. They're going to welcome them back. So there is this promise of renewed order. All right, so we'll end it off there, and the next note we'll talk a little bit about more specifically the play and the character Macbeth as a tragic hero.